There are people who move through the world with a quiet distance in their eyes. People who say they hate people, not out of cruelty but out of exhaustion. You see them in crowded rooms, withdrawing into the corners. You see them online, retreating from noise that others seem perfectly able to tolerate. And maybe sometimes you feel this way too. This feeling isn't born from darkness. It often grows from being too observant, too porous, too aware of what others miss. You notice the sharpness of human behavior, the carelessness, the inconsistency, the unspoken expectations. And beneath the surface, something aches. This is not a story about disdain. It is a story about overwhelm, about sensitivity disguised as indifference, and about the quiet psychology behind those who pull away to protect what is left of themselves. There is a moment, small, almost invisible, when you begin to feel yourself stepping back from people. It doesn't happen suddenly. It's more like the slow dimming of a light, the way dusk becomes night without announcing itself. One day you simply notice that the world feels too loud, too sharp, too demanding. Conversations drain you more than they connect you. Interactions feel like small storms you must brace yourself against. And deep inside, something whispers, "I don't want to deal with people anymore." You don't say it with pride. You don't say it with anger. It comes out as protection, as a shield against the subtle ache that builds each time you are misunderstood or overwhelmed. You tell yourself you're just tired, just busy, just needing space. But the truth hums beneath those excuses. Being around people feels heavier than it should. For some, this withdrawal begins after a specific moment, an argument, a betrayal, a disappointment that cracks the surface. For others, it's the cumulative weight of too many social demands, too many emotional mismatches, too many times you gave patience, understanding, or warmth that wasn't returned. When you say, "I hate people," you're really saying, "I hate how people make me feel when I am already stretched thin." Or, "I hate how much I notice, how much I absorb, how much it hurts when the world feels careless." Sometimes you look around and wonder how others navigate humanity so easily. They make small talk with strangers. They forgive interruptions. They brush off bad attitudes. Meanwhile, you carry every detail, tones, expressions, inconsistencies. It's like your mind collects what others ignore. The weight of awareness becomes a burden you didn't ask to hold. This is the quiet withdrawal, the slow retreat into the inner world where things feel safer, softer, more predictable. You start choosing silence over conversation, solitude over company, certainty over chaos. Not because you dislike people as individuals, but because being around them requires more emotional currency than you have left. There's also a quiet frustration that builds over time. The kind born from seeing too much of human nature. The impatience, the contradictions, the carelessness with feelings, the lack of depth in daily interactions. You feel the gap between what you give and what people offer in return. You feel the imbalance of emotional effort. And slowly your system begins to protect itself. It withdraws. It shields. It closes the door halfway, not with finality but with hesitation. You become the observer instead of the participant. You sit in spaces where others talk but you drift into the background, watching from the edges. And oddly, that distance feels comforting. It gives you room to breathe without needing to perform, react, or pretend. You tell yourself you're better off alone, even if a small part of you quietly longs for understanding. The truth is, people who say they hate people rarely hate anyone. They hate feeling overwhelmed. They hate the emotional noise that comes with unpredictable human behavior. They hate the way connection feels like a test they're constantly failing, even when they're trying. And beneath it all, there is sensitivity, an emotional depth that makes you absorb life more intensely than you know how to manage. This chapter is the doorway into that experience. It is the recognition of the inner shift, the moment you begin to pull back. not because you are cold, but because you care too much, feel too deeply, or burn out too easily. It is the beginning of understanding that your withdrawal is not a flaw. It is a message. A quiet signal from your inner world saying, something here is too much. Something here needs space. Something here is asking to be protected. And so you step back, not out of hatred, but out of self-preservation, out of longing for peace, out of the desire to feel safe again in a world that often overwhelms you without meaning to. Before someone ever says, "I hate people," there is usually a story that came long before the words. A story that began quietly years earlier, in places where emotional wounds form without anyone noticing. Nobody wakes up one morning with a dislike for humanity. It is shaped, slowly, subtly, through the environments that raised you, the relationships that molded you, the patterns you learned without understanding their impact. Often, it starts in childhood, in the small emotional imbalances that stretch a young mind too far. Maybe you were the child who paid attention to everything. The tones adults used when they were tired, the expressions friends made when they were irritated, the tension in the room long before anyone said a word. You sensed things others dismissed. You felt responsible for emotional weather you didn't create. You learned early that people could be unpredictable, inconsistent, or overwhelming even when they meant well. Sometimes the wound begins with trust, or rather with the breaking of it. You might have trusted someone who didn't protect your vulnerability. Maybe they criticized what made you soft. Maybe they ignored your needs. Maybe they walked away when you needed steadiness. Small acts of dismissal, repeated enough times, teach the nervous system that people can't always be counted on. Not for safety. Not for emotional clarity. Not for gentleness. Or perhaps the wound grew from overexposure, being constantly surrounded by demands, noise, conflict, or chaos. Environments where emotions ran high and boundaries were never honored. Sometimes, children who grow up in such spaces develop an exaggerated sensitivity to human behavior. They become hyper-aware, hyper-responsible, hyper-alert. Their minds learn that the presence of people equals the presence of tension. So later in life when they say, "I hate people," what they often mean is, "Being around people reminds my body of what it had to survive." Then there are those whose origins lie in rejection or isolation. The child who didn't fit in. The teenager who felt out of sync with social circles. The young adult who tried to connect but always sensed something missing in the exchange. Repeated moments of not belonging create a quiet belief. People don't understand me. Over time, that belief hardens into distance, and distance hardens into withdrawal. And for some, the wound comes from betrayal, the kind that shatters something foundational. The friend who turned away. The partner who lied. The trusted figure who exposed vulnerability. These experiences leave behind a residue, a sting that grows each time trust is misplaced. A heart that is repeatedly disappointed learns to protect itself aggressively. It learns to armor up. It learns to step back before anyone can step too close. Even the most subtle relational wounds can shape this psychology. The feeling of being overshadowed. The sense of never being understood. The pressure to perform socially. The exhaustion from being the strong one, the responsible one, or the emotionally stable one in your family. Sensitivity mislabeled as dramatics. Introversion mistaken for rudeness. Depth mistaken for seriousness. So many people grew up being misread, and that misreading became part of their emotional DNA. What unites all these origins is a simple truth. People who hate people are rarely born cynical. They are shaped by a world that overwhelmed them before they developed the skills to navigate it. Their dislike isn't natural, it is learned. It is stitched into them by repeated experiences of emotional mismatch. But beneath that learning is something even quieter, a longing for safety, a longing for honesty, A longing for relationships where someone sees the real inner world without demanding it shrink or harden. This chapter is about acknowledging where the wound began, not to blame the past but to understand the shape it left inside you. Humanity disappointed you long before you declared your distance from it, and your withdrawal is not a failure. It is the echo of experiences that taught you the cost of being close. You do not hate people. You hate the wounds people left behind. There is a reason the mind grows tired around people. A reason the world feels heavier, louder, sharper than it seems to feel for others. What looks like hating people from the outside is often the surface expression of a deeper psychological reality. One shaped by sensitivity, cognitive load, emotional thresholds, and the brain's way of processing human behavior. Some people are wired with high sensory awareness. Their nervous systems absorb more information than the average person. Shifts in tone, fleeting expressions, background noise, emotional tension. They notice the details others overlook. Their mind doesn't filter, it gathers. Every interaction becomes a constellation of signals to decode, a landscape to navigate carefully. This constant intake exhausts the cognitive system. So when they say, "I don't like being around people," what they're often describing is sensory overload, an overstimulated system that needs quiet to reset. Others carry high emotional sensitivity, not as fragility but as depth. Their capacity for empathy is wide, their emotional perception intricate. They feel what others feel, sometimes too quickly, sometimes too fully. Being around people is not neutral, it is relational work. It requires attunement, responsiveness, awareness. Sensitivity is a gift, but it also creates fatigue. When emotional depth goes unrecognized, unsupported, or unbalanced, it becomes a private burden. In these people, hating people is often the mind's way of saying, "I feel too much all at once." Then there is social fatigue, a psychological state not caused by disinterest but by depletion. Some personalities need time alone to recharge, while society expects constant engagement. Crowds, conversations, and group dynamics drain their internal battery. After a point, even small talk feels like a task. Their withdrawal is the result of an internal meter reaching empty, long before the world expects it to. To them, the phrase, "I hate people," is shorthand for, "I have nothing left to give my surroundings." There are also those whose brains operate along neurodivergent lines. People who think intensely, feel intensely, interpret intensely. They may have heightened pattern recognition, deeper analytical tendencies, or nonlinear emotional processing. Human behavior, with all its inconsistencies and contradictions, becomes mentally taxing. The unpredictability of people creates anxiety or cognitive strain. Social rules that others follow instinctively can feel confusing or superficial. Their distance is not disdain. It is an adaptive response to a world that never matched their processing rhythm. Attachment patterns also play a role. People shaped by anxious or avoidant attachment often experience relationships as unpredictable or draining. Their early interactions taught them that closeness might bring instability, criticism, or disappointment. So the adult version of that lesson becomes emotional withdrawal. The persona of disliking people is a shield crafted from psychological history, a way to maintain control over environments that once felt unsafe. Even moral idealism plays a part. People who feel deeply about honesty, integrity, or fairness often become disillusioned when daily interactions don't meet their internal standards. This disappointment can shift into cynicism, not because their standards are too high, but because their heart was too open for too long. What appears as misanthropy is often a collage of all these elements. A sensitive nervous system, a perceptive mind, emotional overstimulation, past relational patterns, social exhaustion, cognitive intensity. And when these traits combine, the persona forms. calm on the outside, guarded in the middle, overwhelmed on the inside. People who hate people are often the ones who expected the most from humanity and were met with the least. They are the ones who search for sincerity, depth, and emotional clarity, but live in a world that often feels far too chaotic and inconsistent. Their psychology is not built on hatred. It is built on sensitivity, overstimulation, and disappointment woven together into a protective identity. The persona is not a mask. It is a coping mechanism, crafted by a mind that experiences the world more intensely than it knows how to express. There is a strange contradiction inside people who claim to hate people, a contradiction that rarely gets spoken aloud. Because beneath the frustration, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the instinctive desire to pull away, lives a quiet longing. A longing for connection that feels gentle. A longing for people who don't overwhelm. A longing for a world that doesn't drain the spirit so quickly. This inner conflict begins with a part of you that still wants to be understood. Even after all the disappointments, even after all the fatigue, there is a human desire, ancient, biological, unspoken, to feel seen without needing to perform. But when the world feels too heavy, that longing gets buried under layers of self-protection. You want closeness, but you fear the cost of it. You want understanding, but you dread the effort it requires. You want quiet companionship, but you're afraid of being misunderstood again. And so you live in the middle, between yearning and withdrawing. In some moments you pull back sharply, irritated by even the smallest social demand. A message unanswered, a plan canceled, a room avoided. Distance feels like the only way to breathe. But in quieter moments, when the world softens and the overwhelming noise fades, another truth rises. You do not actually want to be alone forever. You just don't know how to exist around people without losing pieces of yourself. This conflict creates an emotional push and pull. One day you feel done with everyone. The next day you feel a quiet ache for connection you can't fully name. People often misinterpret this as inconsistency. But it is not inconsistency, it is emotional survival. The heart leans out, craving connection. The nervous system flinches, recalling the exhaustion. The mind pulls back, seeking safety. And you remain caught in the cross-current of the three. The resentment you feel toward humanity is rarely about individuals. It's about patterns, behaviors, expectations, energies that feel too loud or too careless. You notice what others ignore, the interruptions, the dismissiveness, the contradictions, the lack of self-awareness. And each of these moments adds weight to the internal argument. People are too much. Yet the guilt follows close behind. The guilt of distancing. The guilt of silence. The guilt of feeling different even if you don't show it. There is also a quieter frustration. The frustration of being someone who sees the emotional landscape clearly, yet cannot navigate it without fatigue. You understand people more than they understand you. You sense their needs. You absorb their moods. You anticipate their reactions. You carry the emotional intelligence that the world often depends on, but rarely gives back. This skill makes you perceptive, empathetic, intuitive. But it also makes you tired. Deeply, deeply tired. So when someone says, "You're too sensitive," or "You think too much," they're missing the truth entirely. You're not overthinking, you're accurately perceiving. You're not too sensitive, you're deeply attuned. And this attunement, over time, becomes a burden few people recognize. The inner battle intensifies when your mind desires solitude but your heart desires companionship. You want a connection that doesn't require shrinking yourself. A relationship where your depth is not a weight but a language. A presence that feels like oxygen, not pressure. This chapter is the crossroads, the place where your contradictions meet. Where your longing sits beside your exhaustion. Where your sensitivity sits beside your boundaries. where the desire for closeness sits beside the memory of disappointment. You do not hate people. You hate what it costs to be yourself around the wrong ones. And so the battle continues quietly, a tug-of-war between the need to protect your inner world and the hope that someday, someone might enter it gently enough that you don't need protection at all. There comes a moment, quiet, almost fragile, when something inside you softens. Not dramatically, not suddenly. It happens the way dawn arrives. Slowly, subtly, through a change in light you barely notice until the room looks different. This moment is not about healing, not about forgiving humanity, not about becoming more social or more open. It is simply the moment when you realize that your relationship with people is more complex than the phrase, "I hate people," ever allowed you to express. It begins when you recognize the pattern beneath your reactions. You notice that your frustration isn't triggered by people themselves, but by overstimulation, emotional imbalance, or expectations you never wanted to hold. You see that your irritation appears when you are tired, when you feel unseen, when you've been absorbing too much for too long. Your withdrawal, instead of looking like cynicism, begins to look like fatigue, deep, systemic fatigue that your mind has been carrying for years. And slowly the edges of your worldview shift. You begin to understand that your dislike is not a fixed trait. It's a reaction, an echo of past experiences, unmet needs, and a nervous system that has been stretched past its limits. You start noticing how your mood changes in environments that feel safe, predictable, or quiet. You realize that you can enjoy people, even care about them deeply, when your emotional landscape isn't crowded or chaotic. This awareness doesn't erase your boundaries, it clarifies them. You start seeing the difference between people who drain you and people who simply exist around you, between situations that overwhelm you and situations that allow your mind to breathe, between human behavior that wounds you and human behavior that is merely human. In this clarity, something becomes gentler inside you. The world doesn't feel less flawed, but your reactions feel less absolute. You start noticing moments of warmth, small, fragile signs of humanity you dismissed before. A stranger holding a door, a quiet gesture of understanding, a conversation that feels lighter than expected. These moments don't change your personality, but they begin to soften the hardened stories you've been repeating. More importantly, you begin to see your own internal signals with more honesty. You notice the tightening in your chest when conversations become too fast, the mental fog when your social battery empties, the tension you hold when someone's energy is too sharp, the relief that washes over you when you step back into silence. You start interpreting these signals not as proof of misanthropy, but as proof of sensitivity, intuition, and a need for emotional boundaries. What once felt like bitterness becomes self-awareness. What once felt like a character flaw becomes a biological and psychological threshold. And then, perhaps unexpectedly, you realize that the statement, "I hate people," was never the truth. It was a shield, a quick, simple phrase to cover a deeper experience. It was a way to give yourself permission to retreat without needing to explain the complexity of your exhaustion. The shift in perception reveals a new truth. You do not hate people. You hate disconnection, noise, pressure, emotional imbalance, and the heaviness of navigating human behavior with a sensitive nervous system. You begin to see that your distance is not rejection, it is regulation. Your silence is not hostility, it is rest. Your solitude is not avoidance, it is alignment. This chapter marks the moment you step out of the rigid identity of someone who hates people and into a truer understanding of yourself. not softer, not more social, simply more honest. You see your reactions not as personality but as protection, not as cynicism but as clarity. And in that clarity, humanity becomes less threatening, not because people have changed, but because you now know what your inner world has been asking for all along. There comes a stage where your relationship with people no longer feels like a battlefield. Not because the world has become easier, and not because you have suddenly become more social or more patient, but because you have begun to understand your own inner landscape with a gentleness that was missing before. Healing in this context is not dramatic. It is not a sudden shift toward loving everyone or craving constant connection. Instead, it is a quiet realignment, a gradual returning to yourself after years of navigating human environments that overwhelmed you. It begins internally. You start recognizing that your nervous system has limits, and that these limits are not weaknesses. They are boundaries shaped by biology, temperament, and experience. You begin honoring the moments when your mind grows full, when conversations feel heavy, when the world becomes too bright, too sharp, too fast. Instead of forcing yourself through these moments, you allow space. You step back before resentment builds. You rest before exhaustion turns into detachment. This self-awareness becomes a kind of inner refuge. You learn the rhythm of your emotional energy. When you feel open, when you feel guarded, when you need solitude to return to equilibrium. You start feeling less guilty for withdrawing because you now understand that withdrawal is not rejection. It is maintenance. And once you accept that, your interactions slowly begin to change. You stop giving more than you can afford. You stop staying in conversations that drain you. You stop absorbing emotions that are not yours to carry. You stop pretending that all people affect you the same way. This self-awareness becomes a kind of inner refuge. You learn the rhythm of your emotional energy. When you feel open, when you feel guarded, when you need solitude to return to equilibrium. You start feeling less guilty for withdrawing because you now understand that withdrawal is not rejection. It is maintenance. And once you accept that, your interactions slowly begin to change. You stop giving more than you can afford. You stop staying in conversations that drain you. You stop absorbing emotions that are not yours to carry. You stop pretending that all people affect you the same way. Instead, you choose intentionally. Not everyone deserves unfiltered access to you. Not every relationship deserves the same emotional investment. Not every social space is compatible with your depth, sensitivity, or inner quiet. This selective engagement is not coldness. It is maturity. It's the recognition that protecting your inner world is an act of responsibility, not avoidance. And as you become more aligned with your emotional boundaries, something unexpected happens. People feel less overwhelming. Not because they've changed, but because you're no longer approaching them depleted. You interact when you have space. You listen when your mind is clear. You connect when your heart feels steady. The world becomes less threatening when you are not constantly fighting yourself while navigating it. Slowly, the perception of "I hate people" loosens. You begin noticing that there are some people, soft-spoken ones, emotionally aware ones, quiet souls whose presence feels like breathing room, who don't drain you at all. Being around them feels like sitting beside a calm river instead of facing a storm. These relationships are rare, but they remind you that humanity is not one thing. It is many things, some overwhelming, some gentle, some aligned with your nervous system in ways you never expected. You also start reconnecting with the simplest forms of humanity, tiny gestures that don't demand energy but offer warmth. A stranger's small act of kindness. Someone speaking with gentleness instead of volume. A conversation that feels unforced. A moment of shared silence that doesn't ask you to perform. These moments don't erase the difficulties, but they create balance. They show you that the world contains pockets of comfort, not just noise. Healing in this chapter is the quiet realization that you don't need to choose between total isolation and total openness. There is a middle ground, space where you can engage without losing yourself, withdraw without guilt, connect without depletion. It is the place where your inner world and the outer world learn to coexist without conflict. The return to others is not a return to chaos. It is a return guided by discernment, clarity, and emotional sovereignty. You connect on your terms with people who feel right, in moments when your heart has room. And in that balanced space, humanity becomes something you can approach, not with fear, not with resentment, but with quiet understanding. In the end, it was never really about hating people. It was about the weight of too many voices, too many expectations, too many invisible strings tugging at a heart that feels everything a little too loudly. You never despised the world, you were just tired in a way that didn't have a name. Somewhere along the path, the world convinced you that overwhelm was the same as bitterness. That sensitivity was the same as detachment. That needing space meant you were pushing people away. But now, with everything laid bare, a quieter truth reveals itself. You never hated people. You hated losing yourself in the noise of them. You hated the way your thoughts tangled when too many energies pressed against your own. You hated the confusion between what you truly felt and what you thought you were supposed to feel. You hated the ache of constantly reading rooms, hearts, tones, absorbing what was never yours to carry. But hatred was never the right word. It was always just a protective instinct, dressed in a harsher language because you didn't know how to translate the ache underneath. And when you finally peel back the layers, when you sit with that truth gently, with an open palm instead of a closed fist, something soft shifts inside you. You realize that your distance was a form of self-rescue. Your quietness was a kind of prayer. Your withdrawal was simply an attempt to return home to yourself when the world felt too close. There is nothing cold about that. Nothing cruel. Nothing unkind. It is the behavior of someone who feels deeply, maybe too deeply, and needs a moment to remember where their edges are. So let this be your gentler understanding. You are not a person who hates people. You are a person who needs space, not to escape the world, but to meet it again with softness. You are someone who cares enough to return with clarity instead of chaos. Someone who steps back so they don't break. Someone who feels so much that they must sometimes feel nothing at all, just to breathe. And that is not misanthropy. That is humanity. A quiet, trembling, delicate kind of humanity that deserves compassion, especially from yourself. Take a breath. Let your shoulders fall. Let this chapter close not with the weight of misunderstanding, but with the relief of being seen clearly. Finally, you never hated people. You were simply overwhelmed, and now you understand.